Hi, I'm Austin Wintory, and this is the Game Maker's Notebook. For this episode, I had the wonderful privilege to speak with Chance Thomas, long-running stalwart of the game industry, 25, 30-ish year career as a well-known composer on projects like Lord of the Rings and Avatar and many, many, many others, Dota, and has recently had the rather curious distinction of retiring, fully just laying down his arms, as it were. And I'm quite certain he's the first composer that I can think of who just arrived at that conclusion, decided they were done, and so they were done. So we speak at great length about that. We speak about his final score, which is among the most ambitious scores I've ever heard of before, if not the most, called Settlers, New Allies for Ubisoft, with one of the most complex interactive music systems that you can imagine. And then about other career travails and successes he's had. He's a wonderful storyteller and thoughtful guy, and it was a great fun chatting with him, and I think you'll enjoy the conversation very much. Chance Thomas.
Austin Wintory.
We are going to sort of collectively pray to the internet gods here that our connection remains nice and stable, because there is a lot I want to unpack with you.
Oh, fantastic.
It's worth saying that we had to thread the needle of your schedule to find a time, because you have been an aggressive globetrotter.
I'm so busy not doing things.
Yeah, it's a first.
So busy doing nothing.
It's truly a first. So let's just start. This is the counterintuitive place to start, because I often ask folks to walk me through their background, what gave them the love of music growing up and led them down this path towards being a composer. But I just can't resist the kind of red meat that is that topic at hand, which is you are quite literally the first, certainly the first we've had on this show, but I don't really know of any friends of mine or colleagues or even predecessors, with very few exceptions, who decided to just put down the pen, at least in a professional capacity, and say, I'm going to change my priorities in life now and actually retire. It is so novel. We could probably spend the entire time talking about that. So walk me through.
That's the question. Should it be novel? So we'll get to that.
Take me into that. Yeah, no, well, I mean, that's an amazing counterpunch, as it were. So what made you decide to retire? Because I made a point of saying, lay down the pen professionally, because I don't know anybody who can actually stop composing or being creative, especially you, who kind of bristles with creativity in a lot of dimensions. So what made you decide this? Did you always plan on it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
Okay, so first of all, I have stopped composing completely. After I delivered the final cinematic scores for the Settlers, New Allies, it was like, I'm done. Of course, that score might have been part of the reason, because I was so completely depleted. I mean, absolutely.
We're going to definitely get into all kinds of depth on that score for sure.
So depleted from that. And I just realized I didn't have anything else to say musically. And I have turned my attention to other things. My wife and I travel all the time now. This planet we live on is stunning.
Yeah, give me a rundown of, it's been amazing watching on Facebook. Wow, I forget how much time. I have a poor relationship with the clock, where I will glance and I'll realize, oh, wow, it's already been a week since I looked at X or Y. And you have been an interesting way for me to keep track of days, because you're in another country from one day to the next, it seems like, or a different continent. I mean, give me a quick rundown of just in the last few months, everywhere that you've traveled to.
Wow. Oh, gosh. Australia and New York City and Thailand and the Komodo Island, Northern California, I could go on and on. It might get boring for our listeners, but this world is such a spectacular place. And one of the things that strikes me, Austin, and has surprised me a little bit, is every new place I go to, it's like, oh, this is the most beautiful place on planet Earth. And then you go to the next place and it feels the same. This is the most beautiful place too. We live
Well, and you live in Utah, which lays claim to some pretty serious contenders for most beautiful spots on the planet as well. So it's not like you're, sort of uncalibrated or something and have this disproportionate reaction to beautiful vistas.
I don't know. I am calibrated, but I still have disproportionate reactions to beautiful stuff. I'm an excitable personality. I always have been. And I find that the earth lights me up. And then I've sort of taken to photography. I'm enjoying that. I'm exploring some creativity there. And then I still dabble in education. Like I just finished a book, and I'm hosting a Zoom seminar. And occasionally, like I'll stop in and speak at a conference or speak at a university music program. But that stuff takes, minutes a week, so to speak. Did I plan to retire? Maybe. Do you know Tim Larkin? You know Tim.
Yep.
Yeah. So
not particularly personally, but I certainly know who he is and his reputation, his work.
Oh, fantastic composer, sound designer, great guy. Years ago, he and I were hiking through Yosemite, and we were having this conversation. It's like, is composing who you are, or is it what you do? And we both felt at the time composing was mostly who we were at the time. But then it's a long hike. It was like all day hiking through Yosemite up to the top of Half Dome and back. It was like, I don't know, 14, 15 hours. So we had a lot of time to dig into this topic. And we kind of got uncomfortable with that after a while. It's like, I don't think it should be that way. I don't think a composer is who I am. I think a composer is something that I do. And if it's something that I do, then it's something I cannot do at some point and still be.
Was there a specific revelation in that conversation that made you flip that switch? Like, was there some lens through which you looked at it, or script that you flipped that made you say, actually, you know what? Now I'm not comfortable with that assessment.
Yeah, I don't know. It might have been the fact that we were out in nature and we weren't composing, and we felt completely fulfilled being out doing this non-composing thing. But that's a guess. As I look back, I can't really point to a moment where the switch.
How long ago was this? When was this hike?
This was like 1998. So it was a long time ago.
Okay. So, all right. Well, so that's telling then. So for example, the entire time that we've known each other, you've been comfortable in this perspective of it's a thing you do. It's not what you are, which means that retirement was not a wild impulse necessarily at any stage, at least in the. Yeah. Right.
And then there's the financial side of it, right? You have to be able to retire financially.
Yeah, sure, of course.
That's something that I've worked on. I have worked on that my whole life. And it's something that I think, not particularly retirement, but taking care of business. I think that all young composers would benefit from having some training in business matters and learning about investing and learning about money and all those things. Because I did that, it brought me to a position to where when I did feel like I'm kind of done with this, I was able to hang it up and be free.
Yeah,
cool.
Business acumen. Business acumen is definitely something that one does not have to know you particularly deeply or for very long to realize that you have a very sort of sharp and appreciative mind of business practice in tandem with the creative practice, which is something I resonate with because I think the two can actually feed each other. I find that
absolutely
finding economically viable solutions to a given project is itself a creative act, and it starts to influence compositionally where you could go and all that sort of stuff. And so I find that, that the idea of, oh, I don't want to talk business, let's just talk creative. I always thought, how do you pull them apart? They've never been separable from my point of view. And you're one of those that always seem to have the exact same, and that also is a glancing blow at another thing I want to circle back to later. But you really quite inspired me maybe 5-ish years ago when you published your kind of dramatic tome about your business exploding, essentially, and just
Matt.
Yeah, well, and honestly, it's amazing to me that was a survivable thing, and that even just half a decade-ish later, you would still be in a position to be able to retire. That's truly astounding to me, because I remember, my father, when I was growing up, always used to have this expression of water off a duck's back, where, the more you can just let things not get to you and shake it off and dust yourself off and move forward, the better off you'll be, and having a thick skin and all that sort of thing. And sometimes it's a lot easier said than done. And that was an instance of of a situation where I looked at your case and thought, it would be so easy to just sit around and feel bad for oneself and not put one foot in front of the other. And it was inspiring to see, but I want to unpack that more. We'll kind of get to that. I'm just still so marveling at the retirement.
Well, can I pause you on that for a minute? You said a couple of things that I really like and I want to comment on. First of all, the water off a duck's back, right? So if you don't take on those things like water on a duck's back, what's the alternative? Corrosive acid, seeping into you and destroying
or just drowning. Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
But
it can be so easy to think that. Now, that even as obvious as it is that that's the better way to be, we all have those kind of midnight of the soul moments where it just feels like all hope is lost. And it's helpful to see examples of somebody, especially in this case, because by every measure, what you went through was far worse than anything I've had to deal with. And so it's like to see somebody bounce back from that made me think, okay, well, now I have no excuse. And I think those kinds of stories are very valuable to put out into the world. So it's also a roundabout way of just my gratitude and applauding you for sharing a horrible story.
Well, thank you, Austin. I appreciate that. The other thing I wanted to mention, I love the fact that you said our creativity can feed our business. It can feed the economic side of what we do too. And well, of course, right? We're creative people, so we can create music. Why can't we create effective marketing? Why can't we create a nice layout on a web page? Why can't we create some sort of financial structure that benefits our client and also benefits us, that might be a little bit outside the box? And so I love that. And I've tried to do that.
Is this something that you've ascribed to?
Totally.
Yeah, actually, I think you were about to basically answer what I was about to say, which is if this was something that was emergent over the course of your career, or if from the earliest days you had that more kind of eye in the sky, all these seemingly disparate parts are actually one whole.
It's funny because as you mentioned that, it makes me think maybe I'm just kind of a control freak, because early in my career, I wanted to write every part. I wanted to play in every part. I wanted to conduct. I wanted to mix and produce. It's like there are so many cool things to do, and I wanted to do them all.
Yeah.
In my studio, I have some portraits up on the wall. One of them is a painting of Leonardo da Vinci, and there's John Williams is up there, Michael Jordan is up there, Steve Jobs is up there. There's just this collage of people who have achieved greatness in some part of their life, and it's been an inspiration for me. And when I look at Leonardo da Vinci, I think, here's a man who broke the mold on saying you have to specialize. No, you don't have to specialize. You can explore lots of different things and maybe even have some success in a lot of different things. So that I think has always been part of my fabric.
I can relate deeply. It's sort of a little bit hidden out of frame, but over my shoulder here is a portrait of Jerry Goldsmith, and next to him Leonard Bernstein. And I've
Nice.
always relished Goldsmith for that exact reason. Is he was fluent in about 100 different musical languages, including
Yeah.
a one or two that he, I would argue, wrote and created. And
Invented.
uh, that's been very inspiring for me as well, because same thing. I was always interested in trying new things and putting myself in kind of creatively compromised situations where you just had to sort of art your way out of it, as it were.
Yeah.
And he was like that in a way, whereas you have John Williams has mastered this very specific technique and not really strayed from it. Goldsmith is sort of the diametric opposite.
Totally.
And I resonated. I mean, they're both geniuses who have inspired me a lot, but to me, that Goldsmith versatility was something, and it's the same takeaway as your Da Vinci. Everyone telling you should find your shtick, and I
Yeah.
thought, well, I kind of like Goldsmith's shtick of not having a shtick. that's
Totally.
that's
And you look at your career, you look at the body of work that you've produced up to this point, and there is a lot of diversity in it. There's a lot of variety. It could have come from a number of different composers, and the fact that it all came from you, I love that.
well, that's very kind. But I will not let you make this about me. And as kind
Hey, I thought you said
of
this
an
was a
observation as
two-way
that is, so
conversation.
well, that was semi-honest. I'm going to dictatorially speak in a very, uh, uh, you know,
Engaging way.
equitable way. But no. I mean, but truthfully, there's just so much that I'm excited to talk about. And so let me ask you this: I won't belabor the retirement issue, but it's just so fascinating because um, it's just so rare, particularly when somebody. There's a difference between the composers that just found themselves struggling to secure opportunities and kind
Okay.
of retired by default. There have been a few of those over time. You think of some of the great Hollywood composers, the David Raksin and Elmer Bernstein and Leonard Rosenman and folks who, you look at the last 10 years of their career or of their life. Elmer is actually not a great example, but a quasi good example. But they were kind of forced, for lack of a better way to put it, into retirement on account of just they weren't really getting hired. I don't think they would have said no. They just nobody really kind of wanted them to. And that's so distinctly different from just bringing down the garage door, as it were, and putting
Yeah.
and taking down the open for business sign indefinitely. Do you see yourself possibly 10 years from now, after you've successfully Lewis and Clarked every map, every inch of the earth, and you've said, as if that were possible in a lifetime, but you
Yeah.
know what I mean? You've just globetrotted. Now you think, I'm ready to retire from retirement. Do you see that as a possibility? Is that something you remain open to, or does it feel like there's a comfort in being definitive? I am done.
Never say never, right? Um, I mean, I've still got my keyboard. I haven't sold my equipment yet,
Yeah.
but I don't envision it. I
Mm.
don't envision coming to a point where I want or feel the need to do that again.
Do you
I
see
don't know.
yourself? I could see. I could see you making a kind of. I don't know how to phrase it. A sort of retirement hobby, as it were, out of adjacent things. For example, there are folks who, you know, they'll own a business that they kind of keep tabs on. They let other people do day to day, but like running a recording studio in Salt Lake or something. I could see where you go, I'm not really in it day to day. I'm retired, but it's a fun thing to be able to pop into the studio, see what people are doing once every 6 months. Do you see any version of that coming up, or is it just,
I think
I really don't have any interest?
I think the closest, I've got my little record label online, and
course.
or
Yeah.
not my record label, just my online gallery, right, where I sell
Right.
my soundtracks. And occasionally I'll do a Zoom seminar, maybe one or two a year. That's about as much as I think I want to do. Um,
Mm.
Retirement is great. And I don't think once you let that genie out of the bottle, I don't think
Yeah.
there's a lot of success in putting it back in, at least for me. And there are so many other things and people and causes that I'm starting to get involved with and give some of my time and energy to that I don't know. I have
Yeah.
loved. Let me just say this because I don't want anybody listening to our conversation to think, well, yeah, why did that guy get into music anyway? I loved music. I mean, music lit me up like nothing else from the time I was a kid until almost the day I retired, maybe 6 months before I retired. But I mean, that's a lot of decades of loving music, listening to it, making it, writing it, producing it, working with artists, working with musicians, working with creative directors and game designers and producers. I loved it. I loved it. I loved it. I loved it. And then it was like, boom, boom. It was like going 100 miles an hour all across the country and then hitting a brick wall. I know that
Yeah.
sounds strange, but it was almost like, okay, I'm done. I, I, I took my little cup of inspiration. I stuck it down into the barrel that we have inside of us to draw out inspiration from, and it was empty. It was like the day before it had been almost full, and now it was gone. It was like literally, you talked about earlier in the conversation, you talked about flipping a switch. This was like flipping a switch. It was almost like my soul said to me, okay, you're done with that. Next.
Well, I admire. I think it takes a courage to listen to that voice, because especially as someone who interacts with young students all the time, I think some of them have a rude awakening of that waiting for them immediately out of school because they look at the realities of what it is to be a composer and all,
Yeah.
the juggling of the business, the constant uncertainty, the sort of what in today's term we would call the gig economy lifestyle of it, where you go project to project, paycheck to paycheck. There's very little alternative to that if you want to write music for a living.
Sure.
And most people are going to likely struggle. It's a tough grind, and you can be at the top of the world and still be struggling with it. And I think some of them, that's very abstract. And then the moment they have any contact with the reality of it, it could be 6 months out of a university program or something, they very quickly discover this is not for me. I don't like this, but they won't let that voice be heard because they've got all this student loan debt and they've got all this kind of ego built up around the idea of it's my identity, it's not what I do, et cetera, et cetera. And so they'll basically just force themselves to live a life that they're quite unhappy with for a while until eventually they kind of flame out. And I always try to say to those folks preemptively, not knowing which in the group that applies to, some subset of a given class of students, I say, you're developing a set of skills right now that are applicable outside of that composer's chair. There's orchestrators, there's copyists, there's conductors, there's engineers that broadly speaking have a lower gear lifestyle than what the composer has to endure. You can work in collaboration with a composer and whatnot and not have to be hustling quite the same way and et cetera, et cetera. And maybe that's for you. And just don't let that ego say, no, I went to school to be a composer and I refuse to sort of betray that. I think so. Just because I've had that conversation a bunch of times over the last decade or so, I've come to really appreciate when somebody hears that voice and they actually go, you know what? I'm going to listen. I'm done. And just, I could put a button on, I promise not to solely focus on retirement, but I do think that it is an astounding thing and it's courageous in its way.
It seems like it's really puzzled you, right? You're like, wait, how?
Well,
what?
yeah.
Come on, man.
It's just because I always had the fantasies of like, the French composer Georges Delerue, who was in the 1993 or so, was conducting his score to the movie. I think it was Rich in Love, and finished the final cue and then collapsed and died in front of the orchestra right on the podium. Or Bernard Herrmann dying in his hotel room after the last day of Taxi Driver sessions. And I always thought, there you go. That's the way to do it.
Cool.
It's like, I can't help but have this romanticized view.
Yeah, I mean, John Williams is still going. He's in his 90s.
Exactly. He'll bury us all, it seems like.
And I love that for them, right? And I think there was a time when I thought, well, how can I ever not love composing music? And for what was it, like 40 years? I never reached that point, and then I did. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the best and the worst then, because I do want to really have a chance to unpack the Settlers. Because I do, you've worked on so many just massive undertakings of scores of Avatar and Lord of the Rings, and obviously running Big Huge, as it were, and your whole sort of production, and what you were doing sort of before games, I actually know sort of nothing about. So I really want to make sure to at least tap into all of those. But I think it's really worth, since we started on retirement, I guess we're going to just sort of reverse chronologically,
right?
And we're going to end with the story of your conception, so
the curious case.
Let's talk about the Settlers. Yes, exactly. Because as you've been very patient with me the last however long year or two, where I was like frothing at the mouth to know more about how this outrageously ambitious interactive system works, as somebody who lives for that, and it's the cornerstone of my passion for game scoring is in interactive music design. You really caught my attention with this idea of just tens of thousands of files all interconnecting, and I'm very grateful that you sent over your the 25-ish page sort of walkthrough of the whole thing is absolutely amazing. It's also worth preemptively stating that this is yet another example of a water off a duck's back, where, although I guess in a sense that took the form of retirement, but the fact that you put everything into this,
let's don't give it away yet. Hold on.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. Just tell the story as if I don't know anything.
Don't give that away yet.
Okay. Great. Good call.
I know where you were going. Let's hold that for a little suspense towards the end.
Oh, well, tell me where the project first came from and what made you decide to go this granularly dynamic.
Okay. All right. So let's go back a long time. Do you know Bénédicte Oimé?
Yeah.
Ubisoft. At Ubisoft. So this was probably, I don't know, 2005, something like that. That might not be the right year, but she and I ended up sitting together at a Game Sound Con during a talk that wasn't especially engaging. So we ended up talking to each other. And Bénédicte is a delightful woman. And when I found out she was a music supervisor at Ubisoft, I thought, okay, this is great. She can become a friend, and maybe she can become a business associate as well. And we stayed in touch off and on over the years. She never quite found a project that felt right for me. One of the reasons is, as you know, I always chose not to work on M-rated games. And she would approach me several times. Well, here's this game. And it's like, well, Bénédicte, what rating are they targeting? And so we never quite found the right project. But I really liked her taste. I liked the way that she talked about game audio. And so when I did my textbook a few years ago, I invited her to contribute a sidebar, which she did, and it was great. And fast forward to 2018, I get a call from her. And she says, you know, all that interactive stuff you talk about in your textbook? I'm like, yeah. She says, can you actually do any of it? And I said, well, of course I can, right? Yes, I can. And she says, can you do more than what you wrote about? I was like, what do you mean? She says, well, there's this developer in Germany, and their audio director has a really ambitious idea about the music for this game series. And I want to suggest you as one of the composers to consider. And I said, well, yeah, you know, I love the interactive design, and I've had some experience with it. Let's go for it. So went through the auditioning process, got hired, and they brought me out to Dusseldorf, Germany for a 2 or 3 day, basically a brainstorming session. And the audio director at the time was a guy named Stefan Randelshofer. And this was really his brainchild. He says, I want to do a granular procedural music score based on acoustic guitar. And I want you, Chance, to go figure out how to do that. It's like, wow.
Do you know what gave him that idea? 'Cause that is so specific and not terribly common for someone.
No, well,
I mean, because even we can even unpack the idea. It wasn't just guitar in a generic sense. He had specific guitarists that he had in his ear. You know, that he had a specific play style and types of guitars. I mean, this is inordinately specific.
It was. And, you know, that sort of speaks to, as a composer, the range of personalities and challenges that we face, you know, especially in the freelance world, like you were saying, because one producer might come in and say, yeah, whatever, do whatever you think. And we've had that happen. And then this guy was coming saying, here's exactly what I want. So I think that he felt that looking at the artwork of the world, looking at its setting, he felt like acoustic guitar would create a nice vibe for that world, specifically fingerstyle acoustic guitar. So, but we had this whole list of objectives. You know, the score had to be procedural. It had to be generated from little bits and pieces that you could assemble on the fly in lots of different ways, so that we could avoid that bane of repetition that you always get in gaming that makes you want to turn off the music. But it had to sound natural too. It had to sound organic. That was another one of the objectives. He wanted it based on fingerstyle guitar. Some other instruments, some other colors could be brought in. I can't remember. There were like 6 or 7 key objectives that we had. And as I went home from those days of brainstorming, I thought, all of this is easy except for one thing. How do you actually make it sound like music? How do you give vector, right? How do you give musical vector to this software that's just grabbing bits and pieces and assembling it on the fly? And man, I wrestled with that, Austin. It's like, God, I don't know how to solve that problem. And one day I was noodling around at the keyboard, and I had a flashback to when I was in college. And when I was in college, I supported myself and my wife by playing piano in nightclubs, piano bars, country clubs, restaurants, that kind of thing. And, you know, I had to cover a lot of time, and sometimes I would just improvise. And I got pretty good at improvising on the piano. So I'm thinking about the Settlers. I'm thinking about, how do you find creative vector for this score? And it occurred to me, I had this light bulb moment. It's like, well, I must have some kind of harmonic probability table in my mind when I'm improvising. Because if I'm on an A minor 7, chances are I'm going to mostly go to a D minor 7 next, right? You know, I might come up to an E flat and then drop back down to the D minor 7. But to be musical in the way that I like, there were tendencies that I was responding to in my brain. And I thought, okay, I can take that out and create a probability table, which says if I'm playing this chord and I have this group of chords to choose from, the odds are 80% that I'm going to play this chord, and maybe only 40% that I'm going to go to this chord, and maybe only 10% that I'm going to go to this chord. And that was the light bulb moment. I thought, if we can set this whole score up to where whatever chord is selected, the next chord is chosen by a properly tested and well-designed and fine-tuned probability table, then at least we can get the harmony right. And if we can get the harmony right, if we can get harmonic movement to go in a way that feels like it was intended to be that way, you have a chance at delivering music to your audience rather than just
So let me ask you, it's a great insight. And you cover it very well in the book. It kind of the breakdown of how you kind of conceived of this, and it's actually very clear. And it's one of those that, like many great sort of systematic concepts, it's actually quite sort of elegant in its simplicity. It doesn't feel like this ultra convoluted set of rules.
Yeah,
exactly. One thing I'm curious about, just to get a little bit into the weeds, is I love this use of the word vector. The word that I often use that I think is, for all intents and purposes, synonymous in this case would be trajectory, where music doesn't just exist perpetually in the moment, but great music is like a great storyteller that's leading you somewhere and has kind of the highs and lows of a narrative arc. And so harmony alone, it won't fully get you there. You would need additional parameters to be able to say, okay, the next chord after this A minor 7, there's a 80% chance of it being a D minor 7 as the next chord. But I would imagine that that's different if it's the first versus it's the 12th chord, that there's a over time, those percentages are going to change based on where you are within the kind of overall structure, right? So I'm curious how you dealt with that, so that because if you zoom out far enough, it would end up having the same problem as any other generative system, where even with well-conceived probability tables, you're still going to, on the whole, be wandering in the woods as after a while. So how do you solve for that? And related, the other, well, let's start with there. There's plenty more to ask. So how do you kind of deal with those challenges?
So first of all, there are two giant branches in the settler score, and the procedural branch is only one. The other branch is event-driven music.
Yeah, cinematics and things like that.
Not just cinematics, but also combat and tackling objectives and meeting people that you want to meet, and little sparkly moments, right, that happen in a game. Also, we should realize that most video games do not have the same sort of dramatic arc as a film, right? Or a TV show.
Yeah, certainly not.
They're more of, well, at least this game. I mean, different games are structured differently. There are some which actually ramp up and ramp down over the course of the experience. This one was more about, I'm going to explore, I'm going to build things, I'm going to have little happy moments. I've got campaigns where I've got to go attack an enemy and take over their village, right? And so the event-driven music helped us in that regard, because when there were moments that were more dramatically immediate, more dramatically intense, where the stakes were higher, right? We leaned into the event-driven music, and that was more like traditional game music. You'd have
Yeah.
introductions, right? You'd have blocks of loops that could like move around and adjoin each other as they played through. You had different layers that you could add and subtract. You had outros, you had stingers, all those kinds of things. But then back to the procedural music, I created 4 different moods within the procedural score. There was a neutral mood, there was a sad mood, there was a tense mood, and there was a happy mood. And so all of those moods got their own harmonic probability tables, their own melodies, their own percussion underpinning, their own orchestral layers, right? And so here's a simple example. Let's say you're working on your village, you've just completed a building. So we're probably in the neutral mood because we're just kind of there's no emotional stakes while you're just building up your
Right.
village. So kind of in this neutral mood. It's nice, it's relaxing. You finish building a keep or a tower, and there's a nice little musical flourish that accompanies that. We had to know what chord the flourish was beginning on and ending on. We had to know how many measures it was so that we could plug that in to the procedural part. So I'm gonna go kind of high level, then I'm gonna get into the details for a minute. So we're in our neutral mood. We have our magic moment of finishing this castle, which is from the event-driven list music. We go back to the procedural branch. Now, while we're doing this, an enemy appears over the hill and we spot him. Now we switch from the neutral procedural music into the tension procedural music. So now we've raised the emotional stakes a little bit, right? So as we decide that we're going to go and attack that enemy army, now we switch into the combat music, which is an introduction, which kind of rolls you up into that combat battle. Then you get combat music. We go, we fight, we win. Guess what? We conquer their territory. Now we're into the happy procedural music until we come back, and then we drop back into the neutral procedural music. So all of these different, I can describe them as buckets. I can describe them as different swimming pools full of assets. All of these different tools allow us to sort of Frankenstein a dramatic sounding score together. And it's not perfect, but it's really good.
When you say it's not perfect, is there any consistent sort of tripwire that it would potentially fall victim to? Because it feels awfully robust. Again, yeah, it's worth highlighting that when designing these systems, obviously we're quite beholden to the game mechanics. If we design some amazing interactive system for an actual interaction that can't happen in the game or happens so vanishingly rarely that the player won't experience it, then we've fundamentally kind of missed the mark, or we're just operating in some abstract and not really doing our jobs. And sometimes games have, you can dream of something that seems amazing, but the game just won't support it. And you're that happens more often than not. So to what do you attribute the kind of imperfections that keep it from making you feel like it's perfect? It is Michelangelo's David.
Well, first of all, I'm no Michelangelo, so let's just get that out of the way right up front.
Well, future generations, it's Chance's Settlers.
Yeah, I don't know. I think when we first started talking about this, you mentioned that a single probability table, let's say for one of the moods, might be great for a while, but then you might need to change the percentages, change the chords that you're choosing from as you get deeper and deeper into the experience. I like that idea. That's cool. I think that, oh man, that's where somebody could go next and maybe,
Right.
fine tune this a little bit better. We we solved the problem of stagnancy, right? We solved the problem of musical stagnancy by creating 4 different moods, with their own asset buckets, their own probability tables, their own specific chords, right? And then having this other branch of event driven music and figuring out a way to sort of stitch them together. And it worked pretty good. Um, I don't know. I don't know. I think a different type of game.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was about to say. I think, in a sense, the answer to the question I asked about how to avoid it, kind of in a sense meandering endlessly, is solved. Not the music didn't need to solve that, because the gameplay solves that for you. Since it's not like you would play for 16 straight hours before one of these other intervening, like combat or a mission objective, kind of something that will forcibly take it into something briefly more linear, or otherwise, if nothing else, something different from what it is. That's solving that problem for you. If you develop a system that says, okay, after X amount of time, now we shift to this probability table. If X time never arrives, it's a completely fruitless endeavor. So it sounds like the game kind of took care of the first thing that I would have clocked as a concern, and which is why I would never come up, which is why you say, oh, well, that's a good idea. Yeah, someone should try that next. We need a different game to support it from the one that you were working on. So it's worth also highlighting. It's actually quite surprising, the email you have from your suffering guitarist printed in the book, in the chapter. Explain that. Just tell that story of the brute force required of recording this amount of material.
Well, before we even get
the toll it took.
Yeah, before we even get to that, let's lay out the fact that since the score needed to be granular, since they wanted to never have it be the same, potentially go on forever, we had to record a lot of assets. So you got the probability table. In the neutral mood, there were 13 chords that I chose. And for structural, for the ability to create structure, we had to figure out, okay, how are we going to record things for these chords? You don't just like, oh yeah, here's a chord, there's a chord. No, so we said, okay, they can be 4 beats long, 8 beats long, or 12 beats long. Okay. And then we had to create arrangement structure too. The bass layer was acoustic guitar. It could be a strummed chord, or it could be a finger-picked chord in 4, 8, or 12 beat lengths. So then we had to match all the other parts of the arrangement to those lengths. But not only that, I decided to introduce some variety into how the finger picking was. So there were different finger picking patterns based on triplets, or based on 16ths, or based on 8ths, right? So you had pattern 1, pattern 2.
Which are effectively chosen at random. Like once we've landed on which chord the system pulls, it then has a randomization subset.
It does. But let's say you chose pattern 2, which is maybe a triplet-based accompaniment in the guitar. Well, now we're also having to choose pattern 2 from the orchestral layer, the percussion layer, and the melody layer. The melody layer was where the assets just exploded, proliferated, because melody is the thing that your ear pays the most attention to. Melody is the thing that's most memorable. And so with each chord length, 4, 8, and 12, right? I had 3 patterns for each of those, right? For each pattern, I did 5 melodic fragments, right? So that means you've got 15 melodic fragments for your 4-beat chord. You got 15 more that are different for your 8-beat chord, and you got 15 more for your 12-beat chord. I think I'm doing the math right. So that's one chord out of 13
Right. Yeah.
for
It doesn't
one
take much
mood.
to realize how
Yeah.
quickly this thing explodes.
Yes. Yeah. So, and there were 4 different moods, right? So the musicians who had to come in and record all those fragments. I mean, it was like doing a sample session, you
Yeah.
know, it's like
Which are
creating a
just
sample.
notoriously taxing.
It's very taxing. And the guitar player that I ended up hiring is actually the world-renowned fingerstyle guitarist Antoine Dufour. And he is such an artist, and he's a perfectionist. He's also really funny and fun to work with. But I would send him, like, here's 600 melody fragments to record on your acoustic guitar. And it was so tedious. And
Yeah, I
everything
can only
had to
imagine.
be, because you were going from this little fragment to this little fragment to this little fragment, the timing, you couldn't be sloppy in your playing, right? Because you couldn't know how to catch up on the next measure or anything like, musicians tend to do. So everything was so meticulous. And one day I get this email from him, and he's like, I just got to tell you, my mental state is not good. He said, I feel like I'm climbing Mount Everest naked, or, he used all these horrible metaphors to describe how this experience was just eating at his soul. And he even said at one point, he said, I would rather spend 3 months in jail than do this. And he says, and I'm not kidding. I said, wow. And so I called him immediately. No, I emailed him immediately and called him the next morning. But I emailed him immediately because he had just emailed me. And I was like, Antoine, please stop. Take whatever time you need. Get away from it. Go out with your wife. Go for a swim. Whatever. Just get away from it. And I'll call you tomorrow morning. And I called him the next morning. We talked. And I shared with him, some of the struggles that some of the other musicians had gone through. I had a violinist who was recording all the violin parts. And he finally got to a point where it's like, I called him up to start doing violin for some of the points of interest and some of the event-driven music. He's like, I'm out. I can't do it. It's so tedious and so taxing. I mean, I think I mentioned this in the book, and I don't know why I remembered this. Bass flute is not the most common flavor that you use in a score. And I had 154 pages of bass flute music for this poor woman.
And you're the only person to make a flute player just sell their bass and never want to play it again.
You know what happened? She actually invented a stand that could hold her flute, right where she needed it at the level when she was sitting in the chair, so that she didn't have to bear the weight of it, right? All she had to do was, push the stops, and that saved her, because, her neck and her shoulders and her arms were getting sore.
I mean, it's hundreds of hours of record. I mean, over what time frame was all this recording taking place, and over what time frame prior to that was the writing process?
Yeah, the writing happened in 2019. Most of the procedural writing happened during 2019 and the first part of 2020. And which is interesting, because when I was finally ready to start recording, bringing the solo musicians into the studio, we were in 2020 and COVID hit, right? It was like March and April of 2020 when I started recording. And, that was its own kind of odd thing. We didn't really know that much about it. So we're all in our masks, like wiping everything off with Clorox rags. But yeah, it was quite the undertaking.
Then how long of a period from start to finish was the actual production? Because it's so much to keep track of. And you do mention in the book how you had to kind of work out some new methods just to be able to manage like the mixing pipeline and all that sort of thing. But how, just in terms of months, when you started tracking, say early 2020, when did you actually finally kind of have the last files dialed in?
I wish I had that stuff written down in front of me. Unfortunately, I didn't get any notes for this conversation, so some of it might be a little fuzzy. I know we recorded all of 2020, and into 2021. I think it was in 2021 that we went to Nashville, and we also recorded all of the orchestral parts. Antoine finished up with all of his procedural and event-driven music, because the game was originally supposed to release in fall of 2021.
Right.
So we had everything done. I think that's the right date. We had everything done by late summer, early fall of 2021. I think they were targeting an October release. Everything was in the game. It was working brilliantly. And then I got a note from the audio director, and he says, hey, this was probably late October. He says, can we do a Teams call? I'm like, why? I'm done.
Yeah, that always has an ominous.
He says, there's some things we probably ought to talk about. And so we had this Teams call, and he says, Ubisoft has canceled the game. I was like, you have got to be kidding me. I mean, this was like, I just been through this big buildup of huge sound post-production only to have it burned to the ground by fraud in the investment company, and then poured all of this creativity and all this intelligence and all this blood, sweat, and tears with all these musicians into the Settlers, the world's largest procedural music score kind of thing. And they said, yeah, it's canceled now. I'm like, face palm.
It's absolutely mind-boggling, and something that I can't wrap my brain around, and you may not know or may not be at liberty to say, but if you were expecting the game to be coming out around October, and that's when they called you to say that, that means that they had a finished game.
Yeah.
That they decide to pull normally cancellations occur on the vine where the higher ups look at it and they go, we don't think this will achieve the quality bar it needs to. Even if we pour all these extra resources and time into it, it'll never get there. Better to cut our losses. It's truly rare outside of a corporate acquisition kind of setting for a finished thing to go into the trash bin. What happened? Are you even allowed to say why they did?
Yeah, I mean, there's some stuff that I just don't know. So I'm probably safe in saying what I do know. They probably, and this is speculation, they probably arrived at that decision back in August or September.
I see.
And this is all public. This part, what I'm about to say, is public knowledge. They sent the game out to the press, and particularly the German press, where the development studio is based and where Settlers has a long, long history of, the Settlers is a deeply German game in some ways.
Right.
And the German press crucified it.
I see.
So I think in responding to that, probably back in August or September, I don't know, they made the decision, well, this is our core audience, right? The people in Germany, the people in that part of Europe. If they hate it, we've probably made the wrong game. And so I'm a little bit further down the food chain, right? As a contractor.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So it took them a while to get around to bringing me up to speed. So I was pretty down about that, but it's like, well, it worked great. We built it. I poured a lot of money into local music economies during the COVID crisis, where most musicians were not able to go out.
God, yeah.
Right? And so it's like, well, we did some good in the world. We had some fun. We did some cool stuff. I guess that's it. About 3 months later,
just pause on that really quick. How long did it take you, again, just in this theme of you have a very powerful ability to water off a duck's back about everything. This truly is the going 100 miles an hour and hitting a brick wall. You've just put so much energy and passion into a thing, and suffered. I mean, like you said, you're getting musicians emailing you saying, I unironically would rather be in jail. It's hard to give more of oneself than the kind of scenario that you're describing, only for it to blow up in your head. How long, and blow up in front of you? I mean, how long from that call and this undoubtedly just devastating, I think you call it soul destroying or something like that in the book, before you come to this conclusion? Well, I guess we did some good. We put some money into the economy, and you give this very chance response of, well, there's plenty of upside to it. I'm still breathing. I got my health. There's all the positives that can be seen. You are human still, I assume.
Yeah.
How long did it take you to kind of shift gears to that more optimistic digestion of this?
It's an interesting thing for me to try to self-analyze. I think I went there first, right? I think that's
it's like a defense mechanism.
Yeah, exactly. It's my years in the business, knee-jerk defense mechanism that I've developed. So I go there first, but then you have grief, because that was a significant loss. And so you go through the stages of grief as you're trying to process this, and grief is funny. You'll be just fine, and then in the middle of your day, something swells up, and you're like, that really sucks that happened. I can't believe it, and you get really down, and you need to go talk to your therapist or what. And so it was not linear at all. It was very jagged.
That I get.
Yeah, but I have to say this too. Not only is it a defense mechanism, but there's just part of my personality, part of my nature, part of my spirit that just is resilient. And I like to be a grateful person. I work on that. I work on trying to see what I have to be grateful about. And so, after doing that for 58, 59, 60 years, it sort of becomes part of your natural way of being. And so that was a big natural reaction, to be happy for what happened and to see the good. But I also had to deal with the grief as it jaggedly came up and poked into that veneer. And it's not a veneer, as it poked into my heart over the next probably 3 to 4 months.
So then the story has a twist at that point.
It does. About 3 months into 2022. Is that right? I don't know.
A year and change ago.
No, I might be getting my dates wrong. Maybe. I'm sorry, Austin. Some of the dates are a little fuzzy. So anyway, let's set dates aside.
That's okay. I'm here for the emotional ride more than the archiving for the Wikipedia page.
So if people want, I can tell you, if you get this book that we're talking about, which is my upcoming memoir, Making It Huge in Video Games, all the dates are right. But we're going to put the dates aside for this discussion.
That's fine.
A few months after the game was canceled, the audio director called me and he said, hey, Ubisoft is making a new game and they want all of your music and all of the music system that was developed for this Settlers game that got canceled, and we want to put it in the new game that we're making. And my reaction was mixed. On the one side, it's like, oh, great. All that work wasn't wasted in terms of being able to expose it to the world. But you're going to take everything we did for this one very specific game and kind of shoehorn it into something else? Is that the best idea?
Red flag with that.
Is that the best idea? But as it turns out, they were making a new Settlers game. They were, making a new version of the game that they canceled. So at least stylistically, voice-wise, the music should fit.
Right.
So they worked on that game. We did new cinematics for it. 40 new cinematics, I think. We did 30 points of interest, which are basically just like cinematics, totally linear. And that was new music that then I wrote and recorded. And that game was supposed to come out. That game was supposed to come out in the fall of 2022, I think. Same sort of thing happened. I got notified that they were not going to release the game. They were going to work on it some more. This was just a postponement. And they were targeting a February or March 2023 release for this additionally polished game. And then I had to do some more little music add-ons for that. I can't remember what they were. So I'm feeling good. I'm feeling like, okay, they took my music, they took the music system, they're taking time to polish it. This is going to be great. Except it's not. Because in shoehorning this massive music system into this new approach to the game, they pulled a lot of stuff out that we had done for the original game. And I said, look, let me come out to Stuttgart. No, that's not right. Dusseldorf. Let me come out to Dusseldorf, and I'll sit with your audio designers and implementers, and we'll try to make the best out of this. And Ubisoft wouldn't spring for that. I finally got to see footage of the game that they were going to release. It's a beautiful looking game. The gameplay seems to work really well, but the music system was really dumbed down. And that crushed me. That was almost
do you have a sense of even why they would dumb it down? Because it feels like I could understand them not justifying the cost to build it up to begin with, but they've inherited a fully operable system. It doesn't. It's like I don't understand the reason to not just use it if the gameplay is similar enough.
And that's part of the issue is the music system, all the hooks, right, that went into, and I guess that's getting into stuff that I can't talk about, but the music system was designed to respond to a certain universe of gameplay. And they went and they broke up and they changed that universe. And so the ability to seamlessly connect, that's why I use the word shoehorn, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
To take something that doesn't really fit and try to cram it into a smaller package.
Basically, just the gameplay itself
had changed. The
music system was designed to respond to things that didn't exist anymore.
Exactly.
That I get.
And so I've seen quite a bit of footage of the game, and some of the things that we planned, they work great. They work just as we had planned to do, and some are kind of broken, and that's frustrating. But the redeeming quality or the redeeming thing about this score is when I put together the original soundtrack album, I followed all of the rules that we had created for the procedural and event-driven parts of the score. So as you go and listen to the soundtrack album, that is the musical experience we delivered in the original game that got canceled. And so as
I liked that as your epilogue.
Yeah, and as I go and as I listen back to that, it's very satisfying, and I'm thrilled to be able to give that out into the world in the hopes that people will enjoy it as it was intended.
Yeah, and you kind of alluded to at the beginning, though, that this project, these roller coaster experiences did, in a sense, break you on some level and make you suddenly think about retirement? I mean, did you start this project thinking I might be on the verge of retirement and maybe one more time up at bat will be sufficient,
No,
or it really truly was just the tribulations of this that made you go, okay,
I think so. That's a fair question, and my wife and I have kicked that around a little bit, and she says her observation as the closest objective observer in my life. She says
right,
it just completely burned you to a crisp, and
yeah.
she's not wrong. Um,
I mean, how could it not? I mean, it's impossible to make a system like that when not coming from a place of caring, because you went so far beyond the sort of minimum viable delivery that obviously it's propelled by a passion and a desire to really kind of plant a flag with something novel and
right,
profound. And for that to blow up in your face, it's like being betrayed by a family member is infinitely worse than a random stranger on the street about whom you have no other expectations. When
sure.
you give everything to something that matters to you in this way, and it kind of blows up or it falls apart, it's a million times more heartbreaking. I don't want to feel like
Let's
I'm
not,
kind of
no, and let me just say, we shouldn't say that it completely blew up. Let's say that it had its kneecaps broken.
yeah. Well, I mean, it completely blew up until it was put back together in a manner befitting shrapnel trying to recreate the thing that was blown up. I mean, it sounds like it really
Yeah,
did kind of follow that trajectory, like the Japanese pottery with the kind of gold laced reconstruction of a shattered pot. I can't remember the term for that, but that's a particular pottery tradition of trying to rebuild something that has been broken. But in any case, not to dwell on the kind of car crash stories, but the thing that had happened a few years earlier with the sort of destruction of your company. One thing that I can't remember is how you even managed to recover from that. It's worth, again, I'm happy to stay very much on the subject of music and the arc of your career, but I will say I found that story very inspiring for its demonstration of resilience when you shared it. So, what's the capsule summary of what happened there for the sake of our listeners?
and we'll need to do the Reader's Digest because I just glanced at the clock and I've got another thing I got to run to here in a minute. But the full story you can get. It gets its own chapter also in the
It's
memoir.
well worth reading because when you blogged about it or what you kind of shared online, kind of an article detailing it, it was moving. I mean, it really affected me. But the capsule, so here, tell you what, you can either give the capsule summary or I'm happy to say go read the book, because I also really just want to get some sense of that arc that led you to all this to begin with, because right now we jumped straight into the deep end, and I would feel derelict in my duties as sort of periodic host of this to not give a sense of what led you to all of this. So take your pick on which subject, since I know you. I don't know how much time you have left in absolute terms, so I leave it to you.
Um, let's quickly summarize the huge sound post production thing.
Great.
A man who ran an investment company, this is a very short version, um, offered to buy my business. And thinking as a businessman, like we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, I had done some things to build up value in my business. Copyrights that I owned, equipment, nice equipment, quality
Wait, didn't you
equipment that
have
I
a
built.
full recording studio and everything? I mean,
Yeah. So it was a lot of stuff. I sold my business. He had purchased a big building in downtown Salt Lake City. It had been a media building. We took it over to transform it into what we hoped would be, basically the nicest studio between New York and LA, right? Just like state of the art, everything. And we got pretty close to that. It was a beautiful facility. We had composition, we had an orchestral recording stage, We had sound design. We had picture editing. It was a true post-production house. Things percolated along nicely for a couple of years. And then one day I showed up at work and there's cops and attorneys all over the building. We found out that this man who was running this investment company that was financing this undertaking, he had been running a Ponzi scheme for like, I don't know, 20 years, something like that. Hundreds of millions of dollars, all kinds of people defrauded. And within 2 or 3 days of that, we were all out on the street. And that was really already hard. But the worst part was that my copyrights, like to my Lord of the Rings music and some other things that I had built up over the years, my equipment was all tied up in the courts, and the law firm would not let me have it. So I'm like on the phone calling my friends because I had a film score coming up like the next week. I'm on the phone. Hey man, do you have any old computers, any old monitors, maybe an old piece of an audio interface that I can do? And it's like it's mad scramble. And thankfully, generous friends did have old gear that they sold me at a good price. And I was able to quickly kind of get back on my feet. And I had a really good season, for several years. After that, I had a lot of work and a lot of high paying work. And so things kind of turned out. I mean, I won't lie. When I drove down to that studio site a few months ago, and all that was left was a giant hole in the ground where they were going to build a parking structure for an apartment building.
Yeah, it's devastating.
That was like a dagger to the heart. But anyway, that's a very compressed, short version of the story.
It's just it's a good story from the standpoint that one of the things that I love about doing this podcast is it gives me a chance by having these longer conversations instead of just sound bites for the sake of advertising the latest and greatest thing, is it gives folks, particularly younger folks, a non-sugar-coated glimpse at all the things that can go right and wrong in this line of work. And you can put yourself out there and make yourself vulnerable. And sometimes you swing and it connects and it flies out of the park and things go amazingly. And sometimes it turns out that it was a grenade coming over the pitcher's mound, and you find yourself, narrowly avoiding death. I mean, it can be so dramatic, and you just happen to have a couple of stories that I thought, these must be sort of recorded for the sake of it, and so look, I know you have to run. If you can give me also the summary of what led you to this to begin with, just what made you fall in love with this at that young age. I know you were a pianist, you said a gigging pianist in growing up, but video game music is such a novel thing to wind up in as a profession. And I actually don't know the answer to this about you.
Well, again, this is another chapter in the book.
This is all just a big advertisement for the book.
That's right. That's right. Go buy the memoir, right? Making it huge in video games. You'll get a kick out of this, but don't judge me too harshly, Austin.
All my opinions are formed. You're fine.
I was making music for the advertising industry, and a friend of mine said, "Hey, my favorite video game company just posted a job listing for an in-house composer. You should take a look at it." This was 1996. And I was offended. I'm like, I'm a composer, video game music. Why, that's just right. And he said, "Chance, you write jingles for car companies."
Yeah, I was going to say, advertising is not normally where most people get to stretch their wings as artists, particularly.
he says, come over to my house and I'll show you some stuff. And I went over to his house and he booted up Gabriel Knight, which was a little bit of a masterpiece in its day. And in the middle of Gabriel Knight is a 30-minute opera or a 20-minute opera. And although the musical accompaniment of this opera was all DLS samples, probably played on an MT32, I saw some enormous potential. And I thought, I'm going to follow up on that lead. And I did. I applied to Sierra Online, met Jason Hayes, among other people, the Blizzard composer who was working at Sierra on the time. He was there in the interview. Got hired, ended up doing the score for Quest for Glory 5, which won Music of the Year. It was one of the world's first music scores with a live orchestral score and interactive digital audio based on a simplified system that myself and a programmer designed. So from the very beginning, when I first stepped into the video game industry door, I was captivated by quality and technical innovation. Those two things captured my imagination and have driven me, for the next 25 years.
That's actually a magnificent bookend, because it's not often that somebody's sort of first real substantive opportunity would mirror in a way their last. Well, first off, most of the time we don't have the luxury of choice of what turns out to have been our last work. It just usually ends up being, well, whenever I died, whatever I did yesterday was the last one, as it turns out. That typically is how that goes for composers. You just hope it's finished. But that's actually amazing that I'll have to go back. I was such a fanboy for Sierra, both the Sierra and the LucasArts adventure games of the 90s. Was absolutely had my heart. That was what gave me that drive to join the industry, because I saw that the storytelling potential in them as an art form. But I'll have to go back and take a look at Quest for Glory 5 and remind myself what you did. But that's a fantastic bookend. Look, you've been very generous with your time. It's only semi-ironically that I say this has all been one elaborate advertisement for your book, because honestly, you've had a pretty storied career. We didn't even get to talk about spending time with James Horner and your experience with Avatar. I absolutely love that you got to have that. He's a composer. Lord of the Rings. I mean, some pretty serious achievements professionally, musically, the whole bit. But as somebody who is just subjectively obsessed with interactive music, I couldn't not spend the bulk of our time on this grand finale, kneecapped as it was, regardless of the Settlers. So thank you for that. Absolutely. Any final parting pearls of wisdom, sir, before I let you go?
Oh, no. It was just a great time hanging with you. And I love your interest. Great questions. I thought we had a wonderful discussion, and I hope people will enjoy it.
I'm certain they will. Now that ironically, you're busier than ever with all your traveling, but I was going to say, now that you're retired, I will finally take you up on that offer to go hiking in Utah one of these days.
Yes. Nice canyon, brother.
I think about that all the time, and I've just not been very good about carving out big enough windows to make it happen. But you definitely inspire me to take that more seriously. So, but in the meantime, thank you again for this, and we'll see you, if not in Bryce Canyon, then in Iceland or Bangkok or wherever in the world we find our paths cross.
That's right, brother. All right. Take care, Austin. Thank you.